invitation. It's lovely to be here. I was actually, I think, John's first PhD student here in Exeter. Before, I think Egenis was even a glint in your eye. Yeah, back in 2000. I actually came here to work on the philosophy of economics. But I ended up writing a PhD thesis in the philosophy of action. And I think the fact that I ended up doing that is actually a testament to how wonderful you were as a supervisor. And also, I'd like to think to the way in which your supervision exemplified some of the spirit that Haddock spoke of in his talk this morning. Essentially, the desire to try and seek out the most fundamental and most taken for granted assumptions and submit them to scrutiny. So, cheers for that. Since leaving, since as you were emerging from under John's wing, I've gone in my, I've gone and done it my way. And but I hope that I've carried some of the spirit of John's teaching with me. Well, we shall see. Stanley Cavell once spoke of the sense of rightness and relief that he experienced as a graduate student on encountering the work of J.L. Austin. And I had the same experience on encountering the work of John Dupré. So here was a philosopher of science, who spoke with a human voice and who sought to resist the impoverished conceptions of the human promulgated by reductionists of various stripes in economics, in psychology, and in philosophy. One of John's most satisfying broadsides against this tendency is the chapter of The Disorder of Things, entitled Reductionism and the Mental. And my central aim in this talk is to celebrate John's achievement in this chapter by bringing out what I take to be its fundamental insight. An insight which I think is devastating for the very idea of reductionism about the mind, and which I think remains insufficiently appreciated. But I also want to then go on to suggest, perhaps somewhat more critically, that there's a tension between this insight and a central commitment of John's philosophy as a whole, namely his empiricism, something we don't like in Germany. So I'm going to suggest that we can't have both of these, and that John's insight should win the day. So it helps to begin with what John calls classical reductionism, and the way to think about this is through some of the pictures that Haddock had on the board at his talk. And this is a certain conception of reality and of science's relation to reality. Science consists in a hierarchy of different vocabularies. And on the standard way of fleshing this out, as we saw from Haddock's talk, at the lowest level, you represented it horizontally, but we'll do it vertically. At the lowest level is the vocabulary of physics, then that of chemistry, then that of biology, then that of psychology, and then at the highest level, that of the social sciences. But for my purposes here, which vocabulary lies at which level is not significant. What matters is merely the conception of a hierarchy of vocabularies, at one level of which, and crucially not the lowest, is the vocabulary of psychology, or equivalently, the vocabulary of the mental. Each vocabulary consists, in part, of general terms which distinguish kinds or types of things. And crucially, the kinds that are distinguished by each vocabulary are in each case, according to the reductionist, identical to the kinds that are distinguished by the vocabulary at the lowest level. And making out exactly what this identity comes to in each case is perhaps the central task for the classical reductionist. Classical reductionism about the mental often comes with a familiar qualification, namely that the identities between the kinds distinguished by the mental vocabulary and the kinds distinguished by the lowest level vocabulary may themselves differ across different, this is John's words, different kinds of mentally capable creatures. For example, famously the kind of neural state with which pain is said to be identical in human beings may not be the kind of neural state with which pain is identical in rats. So this is sometimes presented as an objection to classical reductionism about the mental, the so-called multiple realizability objection, namely that the same kind of mental state may be realized by different kinds of lowest level state in different kinds of mentally capable creatures. But as a number of philosophers have noted, John is one, David Lewis is another, this isn't an objection to classical reductionism about the mental, but a version of it. Nonetheless, John is explicit in the light of this so-called objection that his concern is the specifically human mind, and I'm going to follow him in this. John's target in his chapter isn't merely classical reductionism about the mental, but equally the position known as eliminativism about the mental. These positions share a common assumption, namely that if the mental vocabulary distinguishes any kinds at all, then these are identical to the lowest level kinds. And for this reason, John classifies both positions as forms of reductionism. But of course, whereas classical reductionism about the mental insists that the mental vocabulary distinguishes kinds that are identical to the lowest level kinds, eliminativism insists that it doesn't. And in this light, concludes that the mental vocabulary doesn't distinguish any kinds at all. The general terms of the mental vocabulary are in this sense empty. Eliminativists think of the various vocabularies on the hierarchy as themselves theories, in the sense of bodies of empirical beliefs. As eliminativists reject the analytic synthetic distinction, they don't distinguish between those sentences of a vocabulary that merely spell out the meanings of terms and those that express empirical beliefs. It's empirical beliefs all the way down. They call the theory constituted by the mental vocabulary folk psychology, as they think of it as the theory of mind that is employed by the benighted folk. And they take the sentences that compose this theory to be not merely false, but empty, on account of the emptiness of the theory's general terms. And as a result, they hold that this theory is to be eliminated in favor of a superior theory of mind, couched in a lower level vocabulary. I think some kind of neuroscience is, or at least was, their favored candidate. Now, about this position, John has strong things to say. He observes that folk psychology, this is for me, John's, I love this. He observes that folk psychology, quote, provides us with the entire resources of language for making subtle distinctions between an indefinite array of possible mental states, unquote. Making distinctions of this kind, John goes on to say, quote, is one of the main things that language is for, and one of the things that language users, especially the most talented ones, are most skilled at applying it to. A bit of rhetoric here, but I like it. One should be astounded and even appalled at the scientific arrogance that supposes that the dry and highly specialized terminology of an esoteric subfield of science should supplant the instrument developed over many centuries by the efforts of Shakespeare, Dante, and Dostoevsky to speak only of the West, and many millions of others to describe the subtleties of the human mind. So when I read that, I thought, this is my guy. Now, here's what I think John's insight is. I suspect I may well be sort of going beyond, but let's go. And so in these remarks, John's insight is on display. Folk psychology, or the vocabulary of the mental, contains the entire resources of language. Now, the underlying point here, I think, is familiar. The vocabulary of the mental distinguishes between general types of mental states, for example, between beliefs and experiences. And it goes on to distinguish between more specific types of mental states of each of these general types. So just to focus on the case of belief, it distinguishes between, for example, the belief that snow is white, your favourite example, the belief that grass is green, the belief that there are no chairs in this room, the belief that there are chairs in that room, and so on. And it's clear that we could go on by giving as many examples as there are sentences of language. Types of belief are, as people say, distinguished from one another by their contents. This is by what's expressed by the sentences that fill the dots in the phrase, the belief that, ... And in filling those dots, we draw on nothing less than the entire resources of language. Not on a specific vocabulary, but on every vocabulary. Now that, I think, is John's insight. And it goes beyond the familiar point that beliefs are individuated by their contents, by bringing out that because the mental vocabulary contains the resources to distinguish between every specific type of belief, it necessarily contains the whole of language. Now, I think it follows from this, from this insight, that the mental vocabulary has no place on the hierarchy of vocabularies with which we begin. Every vocabulary on the hierarchy excludes every vocabulary at a higher level, and at least in principle contains every vocabulary at a lower level. For example, the language of biology might contain the language of physics, but the language of physics doesn't contain the language of biology. I mean, if it did, then the claim that biological kinds are identical to physical kinds would lack any substance. But the language of the mental does not exclude any vocabulary. It contains the whole of language. Now that might make it look as if it belongs on the highest level of the hierarchy. But the truth is it doesn't belong on any of the levels. So suppose that we have before us a picture of the complete hierarchy. John's insight entails that the language of the mental is not one of the languages in the picture, but the language of the picture itself. And we can bring this out by continuing to understand each language on the hierarchy as a specific theory, in the sense of a specific body of empirical beliefs. In picturing the complete hierarchy, we are picturing every specific theory. John's insight is that the language of the mental contains every specific theory. We can take the sentences of every specific theory and accompany every one of them by the phrase, the belief that. And the result will not be a new specific theory. If it was, then we wouldn't have taken the sentences of every specific theory. The result, in the case of every specific theory, will be the same specific theory, but now expressed in a way that makes explicit its character as a theory, as a body of beliefs. This is what it means to say that the language of the mental is not one of the theories on the hierarchy. It runs through everything, in that its office is merely to make explicit the character of every theory as such. In this sense, it is, as John says at one point in the chapter of the disorder of things, not itself a theory at all. John arrives at this insight by considering distinctions, not between types of belief, actually, but between types of experience, and specifically between types of experience of wine. But the point he's making is the same. The language that we use to distinguish between types of belief contains the language that we use to distinguish between states of the world, between, say, there being no chairs in this room and there being chairs in that room. The language we use to distinguish between types of experience of wine is merely a specific case of this because it contains the language we use to distinguish between types of wine. We, or at least those of us, not me, those of us with the relevant expertise, distinguish experiences of wines by distinguishing wines. by distinguishing them as, to use some of John's examples, romantic wines, banal wines, presumptuous wines, adventurous wines, and so on. And it's and so on. And it's clear we, or at least those of us with the expertise, could go on by giving as many examples as there are types of wine. Now the language that John uses here is somewhat Thurber-esque. And this explains his citation from Robert Louis Stevenson, which I've taken as my title, "And the Wine is Bottled Poetry." But the important thing, I think, is not the rhapsodic character of the language that's used to distinguish between types of experience of wine, but rather the fact that this language contains the language that's used to distinguish between types of wine. Not so much that the wine is bottled poetry, but rather that the complexity of the mind reflects the complexity of the wine, and more generally, the complexity of the world. And this itself reflects the fact that the vocabulary which we use to distinguish between specific types of experiences and beliefs contains the whole of language. John focuses on the cases of experience and belief, and I've been following him in this here. When I talk about folk psychology or the vocabulary of the mental, it's the language of experience and belief that I have in mind. Now, although John arrives at this insight by considering eliminativism, he does succeed, I think, in pulling the rug out from under eliminativism and classical reductionism alike. Classical reductionists like to say that they're not eliminativists, on the grounds that whereas eliminativists hold that the mental vocabulary is empty, they hold the opposite, because they insist that the mental vocabulary distinguishes kinds that are identical to the lowest level kinds. But the truth is that classical reductionism is a form of eliminativism, because it shares the crucial assumption that the language of the mental is one of the vocabularies on the hierarchy. If that assumption were true, then there would be no such thing as the vocabulary of the mental. I think that is what John's insight has helped me to see. Classical reductionism is a form of eliminativism. John never says that, but I'm saying it, because it does implicitly what eliminativism does explicitly. It eliminates the language of the mental. And this has a radical, obvious consequence. To say that there's no such thing as this language is to say that the terms distinctive of this language, such as theory and belief, are empty, i.e. meaningless. There's no such thing as a theory or a belief. So the entire hierarchy vanishes. Eliminativism, in both its standard and its classically reductionist versions, eliminates every specific theory. Not just what it calls folk psychology, but neuroscience as well. I should say, if eliminativists don't see that their position has this consequence, then it's because of their assumption that the language of the mental is one of the vocabularies on the hierarchy. But this assumption makes it look as if the elimination of the mental vocabulary needn't unsettle the rest of the hierarchy. But of course, that assumption is the very assumption, that the language of the mental is one of the vocabularies on the hierarchy, is the very assumption that guarantees the elimination of the entire hierarchy. The assumption that guarantees that consequence is the very assumption that blinds those who endorse it from seeing that it has that consequence. And this consequence is surely devastating for eliminativism. Eliminativism, in both its standard and its classically reductionist versions, is, or at least purports to be, a certain conception of reality and of science's relation to it. But if eliminativism were true, there'd be no such thing as science. If eliminativism were true, eliminativism would be empty. So in this way, eliminativism eliminates itself. I should say that it's perhaps worth noting that it's not merely the standard version of eliminativism and classical reductionism that count as versions of eliminativism. So would a version of anti-reductionism that shared the assumption that the mental vocabulary was on the hierarchy, but claims that that vocabulary distinguishes kinds that aren't identical to the lowest level kinds. It's the shared assumption that would be enough to make that position no less anti-reductionist position, so-called, no less self eliminated. So far, we've concentrated in the consideration of folk psychology, so-called, on the phrase, the belief that, ... Now, of course, that phrase doesn't exhaust folk psychology, even if we keep our focus on the language of belief. There's also the phrase, I believe that, ... for example. And the same point applies here. Every sentence of every theory could equally be accompanied by this phrase. And the result in that case would equally not be a new theory. Just as the phrase, the belief that, ... doesn't contain any empirical information over and above that contained in the beliefs it accompanies, the same goes for the phrase, I believe that. That's another consequence of John's insight. And it actually matches an idea in the contemporary philosophy of mind, associated with Gareth Evans, called the transparency of belief. This idea is that it treats an empirical belief as a positive answer to a question of the form, is it the case that P? And it holds that there's no difference in empirical information between a positive answer to a question of this form and a positive answer to a question of the form, do I believe that P? The move from a positive answer to the first question to a positive answer to the second is not a move from one empirical belief to another empirical belief. It's not a move that involves any growth in empirical information at all. Right, so we've now arrived at the shores of empiricism. And in so doing, we might think that we're coming close to a tension in John's philosophy as I've presented it. If empiricism is the idea that the meaningfulness of language consists solely in its containing empirical information, then John's insight is in tension with empiricism, so understood. But John is, in his words, a self-confessed empiricist. So it might seem that John must endorse empiricism, so understood. And therefore it might seem there's a broader, if I'm right, there's a broader tension in his work between his insight and his empiricism. But when John speaks of his empiricism, he seems to have something a little more subtle in mind, namely that metaphysics, the attempt to articulate the fundamental structure or form of reality, is itself an empirical inquiry, to be prosecuted by synthesizing the results of empirical science. Perhaps there are discourses whose meaningfulness does not consist in their containing empirical information. John's empiricism is merely that metaphysics is not a discourse of that kind. It is an empirical discourse. How much time do
we had about 23 minutes, yeah.
Oh,
yeah. 12 minutes.
Okay. So I think there's a tension between John's insight and this. Thank you for telling me that. I can't really do the math. I can't. It's no joke. It's no joke. So John's insight is in tension with this seemingly more subtle version of empiricism as well. I've just tried to say briefly why I think this is. Maybe the way to do this is to see how John's insight relates to another idea from the contemporary literature, namely the idea that the ultimate ground for rejecting reductionism about the mental lies in the subjectivity of the mind. That's the thesis of Nagel's influential essay, What It Is Like to Be a Bat. Now, John, in a paper which I rather like, takes issue with the way in which Nagel and many others seek to spell out this thesis through the seemingly endless repetition of different versions of the phrase what it's like. And I'm fully in agreement with John in finding this practice kind of less than helpful. But I do think that the idea that the mental is subjective and as a result irreducible to anything objective is really one of the great insights in philosophy. And I actually think it's the very idea that John's insight has itself helped us to get to. I sort of want to defend at least what Nagel wanted to say, rather than the way he said it. Something like this: what's objective just is what is described by a language on the hierarchy. The mental is subjective in that the language of the mental does not belong on the hierarchy in the way I've tried to explain. And the case of belief brings out vividly what this comes to. Belief is transparent in two directions, to the world and to itself. And John's insight helps us to see this and to see that these two directions necessarily go together. Beliefs are transparent to the world in that they're identified by their contents. And because the identification of their contents draws on the entire resources of language, and so on every theory about the world, they're equally transparent to themselves in that their self-ascription is not itself a theory, as we saw. No empirical inquiry is needed to move from a positive answer to the question, is it the case that P, to a positive answer to the question, do I believe that P? The subjectivity of belief just should be understood as its transparency in both of these directions together. And I think the non-empirical character of metaphysics not being an empirical inquiry, just falls out of this transparency. Just try and explain why I think this. To say that beliefs are transparent to themselves in the way I've just explained could be put by saying that beliefs are not merely conscious, but self-conscious. When we speak of the self-consciousness of belief, we mean just whatever we express it by a positive answer to the question, do I believe that P? Said that this answer contains no empirical information over and above the empirical information contained in a positive answer to the question, is it the case that P? Now, in the self-consciousness of belief, we are conscious of what we believe. And what we believe isn't just a random plurality of elements. It's a plurality of elements that hang together in a certain way, or equivalently, a plurality of elements that bears a certain form. In being conscious of what we believe, we're conscious of what we believe as bearing this form. Fundamentally, we're conscious of it as bearing the form, this is so. Now that's the fundamental form of what we believe, and it's equally the fundamental form of the state of the world. The sameness of the fundamental form of what we believe and the fundamental form of reality falls out of the fact that we distinguish between specific types of belief by using nothing other than the language that we use to distinguish between states of the world. The attempt to articulate the fundamental form of what we believe is a non-empirical inquiry, in that it's an attempt to articulate the fundamental form of what we're conscious of in the self-consciousness of belief. And that just is the attempt to articulate the fundamental form of the states of the world. That's why metaphysics is a non-empirical inquiry, because it's an attempt to articulate the form that is at once the form of thought and the form of reality. In spite of their many differences, the metaphysical inquiries that we find in ancient philosophy, I think in Aristotle's categories, and also in more modern philosophy and Kant's first critique, both meet this description. Each seeks to articulate the fundamental form of thought and reality, and in so doing to articulate the more determinate forms into which that fundamental form is itself articulated. The idea that metaphysics is an empirical inquiry just is the idea that the articulation of what we believe, and a fortiori of the fundamental form of what we believe, is an empirical inquiry. And that's just what John's insight denies. So I think when we think John's insight through, in the way I've tried to do, we see that it's in tension with his empiricism about metaphysics. Now, as I think that John's insight is an insight, I don't think we can deny it. So against the background of this tension, I think we have to leave aside John's empiricism. I should say, this I think need not unsettle anything John has ever said. When he does, he's what he calls metaphysics for two reasons. I mean, either we accept John's self-understanding that he's doing something, an empirical inquiry, in which case I would have to say, well, he's not doing metaphysics then. He's sort of providing a kind of comprehensive empirical theory of the world. He's just doing empirical science at an abstract level. Or I'd have to say, no, John actually is doing metaphysics, it's just he doesn't understand his own enterprise properly. He actually isn't the empiricist that he thinks he is. maybe that's too ironic. Anyway, the error that underwrites reductionism, or equivalently eliminativism, in all its versions, is empiricism about the language of the mental. The idea that the meaningfulness of this language consists solely in its containing empirical information. John's insight is in tension with empiricism so understood, and in rejecting that, and in being in tension with that, it's equally in tension with his own empiricism about metaphysics. I think the source and content of what I called at the outset the impoverished conception of the human just is empiricism, so understood. So John's insight sets us the task of thinking beyond empiricism. And I want to end with one final word about it. So far we've concentrated on only two phrases from folk psychology. The believe that, ... and I believe that, ... But this insight and its ramifications isn't restricted to these phrases. That's in the first person, of course, I believe that, and the insight equally applies to the second and third person phrases, you believe that, and they believe that. Every sentence of every theory could equally be accompanied by these phrases. And this reflects the fact that theories are not abstract objects, but social possessions. And I think it has the following consequence. We began by noting that on the standard way of fleshing out the idea of a hierarchy of vocabularies, the language of the social sciences lies just above the language of the mental. Now, of course, there are various things we might mean by the social sciences, but at least one thing that it's meant, surely, are those disciplines that are in some way concerned with other people and with what they think. These disciplines employ vocabularies that contain second and third person cases of the language of belief. And, I would say, it's a consequence of John's insight that these cases of this language equally contain no empirical information of their own. Now, that might seem to be the most extraordinary idea. Surely these social science disciplines are empirical inquiries of some kind. But really, I think it is the negation of this idea that is extraordinary. Our relations with one another, through which we come to say such things as you think and they think, do not consist in subjecting one another to empirical scrutiny. They consist in being with one another, and perhaps essentially in speaking to one another. If it makes sense to speak of those disciplines that are concerned with other people and with what they think as having a method, then this does not consist in observation, but in participation, and perhaps centrally in conversation. Articulating what exactly this method comes to is, I think, one of the great intellectual tasks. And whatever the method is, it is not straightforwardly empirical or a posteriori, but nor is it straightforwardly pure or a priori. Each side of that distinction, you might say, takes in each other's washing, is intelligible only in terms of the other. Executing the task is going to involve somehow getting beyond this distinction. And I think that's a point that reflective social scientists, as well as philosophers of the Geisteswissenschaft, have long recognized. The conception of the language of the mental as a body of empirical beliefs suppresses this task by flattening this language to the empirical level. One of the best things about John's insight is that by demolishing this conception, it enables this task to come into focus. The task of articulating what it is for us to be with each other and the distinctive manner of understanding to which this distinctive manner of activity gives rise. I can't execute this task here today, but I believe that Jane Carl will speak about it tomorrow.